Every 3 years, on the second Sunday of Advent, we hear the familiar passage that was read this morning from the 11th chapter of the prophet Isaiah. Now, for those who might not know it, we have a lectionary or schedule of readings that are assigned on a 3-year rotation, and that's what governs what we hear Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. I can guarantee you I do not pick these. If I did, I would pick easier ones. The totality of this particular reading from Isaiah is really quite wonderful, but it's those last verses, 5 verses, that strike me as quite incredible. Listen again. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt nor destroy all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. On that day the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples. The nations shall inquire of him, and his dwelling shall be glorious. When I hear this particular reading, I can't help but think that there are at least 2 possibilities available to us for our response to Isaiah. The first is just simply to believe that Isaiah was nutty as a fruitcake. Nothing like this could ever possibly happen in our world. But the second thought, always overwhelming the first doubt, asserts that indeed remarkable things can really happen. And we know that because we have seen those things happen. Just as this reading from Isaiah comes our way every 3 years, so does a particular story I have told 6 years ago and again 3 years ago come your way. And I can risk telling it again because a few of you have not heard it, and some or most of you have forgotten it. That's one of the great things about being here long enough. You can recycle some things. But this is truly an Isaiah-type story. And it's also a story that I believe really talks about Advent and what it's about. For a moment, remember back to that line that the weaned child can put its hand on an adder's den. An asp and an adder are about as poisonous as can be found in the snake family. You just do not want to fool with these guys. And while my story doesn't involve harmlessly playing with these snakes, it does tell a tale that is equally remarkable. Years ago, when I lived in Salt Lake City, I was responsible for visiting all the Episcopalians that happened to be at the University of Utah Hospital. And after visiting them, I'd often do that at the end of the day, and then I would drive home. And I would drive on a route that took me by a facility in Research Park, which is part of the university campus, that housed over 1,000 types of venomous snakes. Thank God for the majority of the time that I lived in that town, I didn't know it existed. Because once I found out that it existed, sometimes I just couldn't take it and I would take a different route home. And I learned about this building when I first learned of the following incident, which has a happy ending to it. And it just lodged in my brain, even though it happened 27 years ago. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. Now, for those of you who have a thing about snakes, like I do, not to worry. It's winter, and all the snakes in the Upper Flathead Valley, which basically are harmless garden snakes, are snoring away, curled up, inactive, quite dormant, under the ground and all the snow that is out there. However, if you are near poisonous snakes that are awake, there's always a possibility that one is going to bite. And that's exactly what happened nearly 3 years ago, or 3 decades ago, at Research Park to a nearly 80-year-old scientist who was struck by a Pakistani pit viper, which is the cousin of a biblical asp. Now, never mind that he had been bitten around 150 times previous. You would think that he would learn that maybe there's a different occupation he could get in. This particular bite was deadly serious, and the serum that could save his life was only located in 3 countries: England, Iran, and the then Soviet Union. Well, the university immediately sent for the serum from England, which was, of course, our closest friend in that group of 3, and it arrived, but it was not as good as what could be gained from Iran or the Soviets, what the Soviets had. And this left our snakebite victim still in very grave condition, just spiraling down towards death. But since we are the church and we can only tell stories in which a resurrectional rabbit is pulled from the hat of death, thanks to the common bond that was found at that time in the family of scientists and still exists, serum was requested and then shipped to Utah from, of all places, Iran. Now remember, at this particular time in our history, Iran hated the United States with an undying passion, and we returned the favor, hating Iran with everything we had in our being. It was Iran, after all, which had held 52 of our embassy people hostage for 444 days. But it came anyway. Even so, sadly, it was still not enough to save the life of our gravely injured friend here in America. And so the 3rd vial from the Soviets was requested, and that was sent to Utah. Now again, note I am not calling them the Russians. At that time, they were very much our Cold War enemy, the Soviets. It had only been around 6 years earlier that President Reagan referred to them as the evil empire. Amazingly, though, it was from both of these countries, who we considered to be absolute threats to our very existence, that life-saving aid was sent to heal this sick man. Who would ever have thought such a thing was even possible? Now, I told you this story has a happy ending, and it is quite simply that the fellow lived another day to continue his research. Again, you would have thought that he might have learned something, but nevertheless, he went on. Just a remarkable scientist with a tremendous reputation. I want to tell you, it was an absolutely phenomenal experience to have this as a local story in our lives. Every night, we'd turn on the news to see how he was doing. Every morning, we'd pick up the Salt Lake Tribune to see if he was still alive. And there he was, and he made it. In a world in which we knew who the bad guys were, something broke through. And all of that which Isaiah said could happen one day did indeed happen right before our very eyes. The wolf and the lamb shared a condo together. The young lion and the goat sunned themselves on the beach, and a cow and a bear went out for coffee and a sandwich in the mall. That's what they did that day. While I'm at it, I want to mention one other little story about the Soviets at that time. Around 4 or 5 years earlier from this incident, I had the opportunity one day, because I was at a meeting in the northwest corner of Washington, to go up to Vancouver, BC for the World Council of Churches. Never seen it, so I thought, well, this is something to take in. And in the course of the day I was there, I went to a lecture, a word of which I cannot remember to save my life today, that was given by an Orthodox priest who happened to be at the cathedral in Moscow, Russia. Making my way towards the door after his speech ended, I found myself toe-to-toe with him. And so one of us must have extended our hand to the other, because we wound up shaking them. And instantly, my world changed. I had just met one of the folks that many of the missiles controlled out of Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls were designed and aimed to blow him to kingdom come. Honestly, that was all it took, that handshake, to see Isaiah's prophecy come to pass. It was a radically different day because of that encounter with that fellow. When we talk about a new coming of Christ into our lives that the season of Advent proclaims, it is couched in, among other readings, this from Isaiah about a little child leading them. And when we hear that today, as modern Americans, we sometimes think, well, that's way too pie in the sky for folks living in our age. It's a nice thought, but really? You think so? Or we discount it by saying that Isaiah was really talking about foretelling the birth of a young child by the name of Cyrus, who would deliver the Jews out of their captivity out of Babylon. And yes, that very much is the context in which Isaiah was writing at that time. But again, when you and I hear it, we hear a story of Jesus delivering us from the utter hell of isolation in which we can find ourselves when we follow a worldly convention that proclaims that we just can't get along with other people. Because it always has been that way, and it always will be that way. And yet, dear friends, we know that just isn't true. A researcher at the University of Utah found that out when, against every single political convention of the time, those defined as people who were supposed to despise us as we despised them pitched in to save this guy's life. And I found that out when I looked at a fellow in the eye and grasped his hand, a man from the country that caused me every single Friday afternoon, right around noon, to dive under my desk at Roosevelt Elementary School because that was the drill to save us from nuclear war, from those guys. In short, God just says, look, I make this stuff happen all the time. You just need to start to notice it because it's all over the place. And the reality is that we can do this kind of thing even ourselves. We can turn anxiety upside down by refusing to be divided. After all, we are people who can usher in the story of the birth of Christ, the very purpose behind Advent, by simply tossing the world's rule book into the wood stove and watching it burn. Quite simply, reaching over and across whatever fences that have been built to separate one another is indeed an activity of Advent. After all, the good news is that our Lord came into our lives to reconcile us one to another and all to God. And the more that we remember that, the more that we live into that in simple things and in some complex things, the less the news concerning the birth of Christ will catch us by surprise. Amen.